June 3rd, 1942. The first bomb dropped silently, its descent barely noticeable to those below. It was a terrifying whisper in the stillness of the Pacific morning, but within moments, it would echo through the hearts of thousands. On this day, history would change, and the war would take a turn no one saw coming. Lieutenant Commander Jack Vincent, a veteran of the U.S. Navy, stood on the deck of the USS Yorktown, watching the calm expanse of water stretch endlessly before him. His brow was furrowed with thought, but his eyes never strayed from the horizon. As a seasoned pilot, Jack had seen the devastating force of war up close. Yet today was different. He could feel it in the air, a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The morning was clear, the sky pristine, but the silence was unsettling. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his chest. There was no turning back. The Battle of Midway was about to begin. And for Jack, it would be more than just a mission. It was a chance to change the course of the Pacific War, to strike back against an enemy that had proven ruthless and relentless. The Japanese had been methodical in their expansion, pushing from one island to the next, conquering at will. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor, they had seemed unstoppable, and the Pacific Fleet had been all but decimated. But Jack and his fellow sailors weren't about to back down. The time for running had passed. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific, was the last line of defense between the Japanese Empire and the United States' interests in the Pacific. If Midway fell, the enemy would be in striking distance of Hawaii and perhaps even the U.S. mainland. It was a precarious situation, but the American forces had a secret weapon. Their code breakers had intercepted Japanese communications, and they knew an attack on Midway was imminent. The U.S. Navy had a chance, but it was a slim one. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the element of surprise had been taken from them. What they had, however, was something more valuable: the will to fight. Jack had flown countless sorties before, but this one was different. The Japanese forces under Admiral Yamamoto were advancing with the same confidence that had propelled them to victory after victory. The odds were stacked against the Americans, and yet the men aboard the Yorktown had been given a singular mission: stop the Japanese at all costs. In the distance, Jack could see the faint outline of the Japanese fleet, its carriers lurking just beyond the horizon. The skies above Midway would soon be filled with enemy bombers and fighters, but the Americans were ready. Every man aboard this ship had been preparing for this moment for months. The pilots, the sailors, the medics all knew that today they would either be heroes or martyrs. The stakes were not just strategic, they were existential. The fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the world, rested on their shoulders. Jack's fingers tightened around the rail as he tried to steady his racing heart. He had flown many dangerous missions, but this felt different. The fear was there, thick and raw, but it was something deeper than that. A primal instinct, a realization that this battle, this very moment, could change everything. The sweat on his brow wasn't from the sun, but from the weight of what lay ahead. "Jack!" a voice called from behind him. It was Lieutenant Mark Holland, his best friend and wingman. Holland's face was unreadable, but there was a steely determination in his eyes. "We're about to take off. Ready for the fight of our lives?" Jack turned to face him, forcing a grin onto his face. "I've been ready since Pearl Harbor," he said, though the words didn't quite match the tension in his voice. Holland nodded, understanding without a word. The two men had seen the worst of war together: the chaos, the bloodshed, the moments that haunted you long after the fighting stopped. But today they were flying together again, and today it would be different. As they made their way toward the plains, Jack's mind raced. The American fleet had positioned itself strategically, though the Japanese had no idea their movements had been anticipated. The battleships, carriers, and destroyers would stand their ground, but it was the pilots who would have the most difficult job: get to the enemy fleet, strike hard, and return. Their lives, their success, would be decided in the air. Jack climbed into his Wildcat, the cockpit closing around him with a hiss. His hands moved instinctively, checking instruments, adjusting the throttle. The steady hum of the engine was a comfort, grounding him as the tension began to grow again. He could hear the calls of other pilots on the radio, all ready for what was to come. There was no going back. And then it happened. The first alarm sounded, followed by the unmistakable roar of enemy bombers in the distance. The Japanese were coming. Jack's heart skipped a beat, but there was no time to dwell on the fear. The engines roared to life, and the planes began to taxi toward the runway. The moment of truth had arrived. In the cockpit, with the world shrinking around him, Jack knew one thing for certain. This was the start of the most important battle of his life and of history itself. As the first planes took off into the morning sky, the air was thick with tension. Every pilot, every sailor, and every soldier knew that nothing would be the same after today. The battle for Midway was on, and the outcome would change the course of the Pacific War forever. But for now, all Jack could focus on was the sky ahead, the rumble of his engines, and the fight that awaited him. The storm was coming. The calm before the battle was over. The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the first wave of Japanese bombers, led by their skilled pilots, began their attack. The air was thick with the tension of impending conflict, and for Lieutenant Commander Jack Vincent, it felt as though the world itself had held its breath and was now exhaling in a violent rush. His hands gripped the control stick of his F-4F Wildcat, the metal of the cockpit cold against his palms. His heart raced, but there was no time to second-guess his training. The time for preparation was over. Now it was all instinct. The roar of his engines was drowned by the chorus of alarms blaring in the control room. On the USS Yorktown, Jack's crew rushed to their positions, every movement frantic but deliberate. The ship, once a symbol of American strength, now felt vulnerable. The relentless Japanese onslaught had begun. Yet Jack didn't have the luxury of watching from the deck. His role was clear. Get airborne, engage, and return. As his Wildcat lifted from the runway, Jack could feel his stomach tighten, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had always known that his job could end in an instant, but there was a deep, gnawing fear now. Not just for himself, but for the men on the ship, for the lives that hung by the thinnest of threads. The air was thick with the possibility of loss, of lives torn apart by a single bullet or bomb. Beside him, Lieutenant Mark Holland's plane roared into the sky, his familiar silhouette cutting through the air like a predator on the hunt. Jack glanced over briefly, catching his best friend's gaze as their planes briefly locked in formation. A wordless exchange passed between them, the kind that could only come from years of fighting side by side. But beneath their shared resolve, there was an unspoken fear. They both knew the cost of war. They had seen friends lost in the blink of an eye, and today the stakes felt even higher. "Stick to the plan, Jack." Mark's voice crackled over the radio, his tone strained but calm. "Stay focused. We've got this." Jack nodded even though he knew Mark couldn't see him. He had heard those words before, during the thick of countless dogfights, but today felt different. The plan had been drilled into them for weeks, but as the Japanese bombers and fighters closed in, Jack's confidence wavered. Could they really stop an enemy so vast and formidable, especially when the odds were stacked so heavily against them? Suddenly, the sky above Midway erupted with gunfire. Japanese Zeros, agile and deadly, had found the American planes. The first explosion shook the air around Jack, a fireball bursting from one of the bombers that had been hit by a stray shot. It was followed by the screams of radio operators who sent urgent messages of incoming Japanese reinforcements. The early morning had transformed into an inferno of chaos. Jack's Wildcat swerved to avoid a series of incoming tracers. His eyes flickered over to the ocean below. The Japanese carriers were still miles away, but their bombers and fighters had found their targets. Midway was under attack, but so was the Yorktown. The fate of the fleet rested on their shoulders. If they didn't strike back soon, the battle would be lost before it had truly begun. "Jack, watch your six!" Mark's voice broke through the static of his headset, snapping Jack out of his daze. He jerked the stick hard to the right, narrowly missing an enemy fighter that flashed by like a shadow. The Zero's engine buzzed in his ears, the shrill whine of its dive a reminder of how close death had just come. "Got him!" Jack shouted as he let loose a burst of fire, the shells tearing into the Zero's engine, sending it spiraling toward the ocean below. But his victory was short-lived. In his peripheral vision, he saw another Zero tailing Mark's plane. The adrenaline surged through his veins as he banked hard to chase after the attacker. But the Zeros weren't the only threat. As Jack maneuvered his Wildcat into a tight turn to intercept the Japanese fighter, something deeper, something darker, started to weigh heavily on him. He could feel the crushing pressure of the responsibility to protect his men, to protect his ship. The weight of command, of decision, hung around him like an anchor. Every second felt like a lifetime, and the reality that they might fail, that they might lose everything, gnawed at him. Mark's voice again cut through the tension, but this time it was laced with an edge of fear. "Jack, I need backup, now!" Jack's heart skipped a beat. His wingman was in trouble. The familiar panic crept into his chest, the urge to rush in and save his friend. But he knew it would be suicide to act without a plan. He had trained for this. He had been taught to think, not to react blindly. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, Jack struggled with the fear that every man he saved today might be someone else's life lost tomorrow. He was their leader now. Every move, every decision would determine the lives of his crew, of his friends. It was a moral dilemma that no one could prepare for. "You've got this, Mark," Jack said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "Just stay with me." In that moment, as Jack swooped low to cover Mark, he saw something in the distance. It was subtle at first, a blur on the horizon. But then, as it grew closer, the enormity of it struck him. The Japanese carriers were coming into range. The battle wasn't just in the sky. It was about to turn into a fight for the very soul of the Pacific. "Hold on, Mark!" Jack's voice was a desperate cry as he banked hard, pushing his Wildcat to its limits. The fight had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. And now it wasn't just about survival. It was about the fate of a generation, the fate of the Pacific, the planes, the carriers, the lives on the line. It was all connected, all converging at this single moment. And the only way to win was to push forward, to fight with everything they had left. Jack's mind raced. The lives of everyone on Midway, the Yorktown, and all the men on the front lines were tied to this one battle. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. This is where the rising conflict begins to take root, as Jack faces the moral dilemma of leadership, the pressure of protecting his men, and the psychological strain of knowing that every decision could lead to both victory and loss. In the midst of this, the attack intensifies, and the stakes are raised as they approach the heart of the battle. The sky was a blur of smoke, metal, and fire. The battle for Midway had escalated into a violent symphony of chaos, and the cost of every moment was measured in lives. Jack Vincent's Wildcat soared through the skies, cutting through the smoke and flak, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a deadly game of decisions, where every choice seemed to lead to more danger. Mark Holland was missing. The radio silence between them had lasted too long, and the knot in Jack's stomach tightened with each passing second. He banked left and scanned the sky, hoping to catch sight of his wingman, but the skies were cluttered with the deadly dance of Zeros, their engines shrieking as they tore through the air, each one a harbinger of death. Jack's fingers clenched the controls harder. Every instinct screamed at him to find Mark, to make sure his friend was still alive. But the cold truth was dawning on him. The mission was slipping from their grasp. The Japanese carriers were just beyond the horizon now, vulnerable but still standing. They had taken heavy hits, but they hadn't been sunk. If the Americans failed to finish them off today, all would be lost. The balance of the Pacific would tip irreparably. Jack knew that this was the moment that would define the war. Midway was the flashpoint, and his every action would either win it or doom it. "Jack," came the strained voice over the radio, "we need to hit them now. They're turning around." It was Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, his voice hoarse with urgency. Best had been leading a squadron of dive bombers. Their mission was clear: take out the carriers and everything else would fall into place. But time was running out, and the Japanese fleet was turning away from the island, trying to regroup after the devastating attacks that had already torn through their ranks. If they escaped, it would be a slow, agonizing defeat for the Americans. And Jack's Wildcat was one of the few remaining forces that could stop them. He turned sharply, his mind racing. Mark wasn't answering, and the pressure of leadership weighed heavily on him. He had to choose. Was he to risk his life to find his best friend, or was the mission too important? Would Mark understand if Jack left him behind? The coldness of reality began to settle in. War demanded sacrifice. There would be no guarantees. Jack fought to steady his breathing, fighting the suffocating sense of responsibility that gnawed at him. He had been trained to make these decisions, but no training could prepare him for the gut-wrenching weight of the choice before him. In that moment, the tension snapped. A Japanese fighter emerged from the clouds, its guns blazing. Jack pulled the trigger instinctively, his hands responding faster than his mind. The Zero exploded in a burst of flame, sending debris scattering through the air. But there was no time to celebrate. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. "Vincent, we need to strike. Now," came the voice of Commander Wade McCluskey, the lead bomber pilot. "We found them. The carriers are vulnerable. Get in position. This is it." Jack hesitated only for a moment before making the decision. He pushed the throttle forward, his Wildcat roaring as it tore through the sky toward the enemy fleet. Mark's disappearance was a painful wound, but Jack had no choice now. There was only one mission left: to finish what they had started, to stop the Japanese before they could regroup. His thoughts were a whirlwind as he approached the Japanese carriers. The flak was intense and the Japanese fighters were swarming, but Jack's eyes locked onto the target. He had trained for this. He had trained for moments like this. The Japanese carriers, surrounded by smoke and fire, were now the only thing standing between victory and catastrophe. Jack dove, pulling the control stick back hard. The Wildcat plunged toward the deck of the enemy carrier, the deafening sound of his engine ringing in his ears as the ground, or rather the deck of the Japanese carrier, rushed up to meet him. His fingers hovered over the trigger, and in that instant, everything else melted away. There was only the mission, the bomb, and the fate of the Pacific. The world spun as he released the bomb, sending it toward the Japanese carrier below. Time seemed to freeze for a split second before the explosion rocked the ship. The deck buckled, and flames burst outward in a monstrous wave of destruction. Jack pulled up, his heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins. The carrier had been hit, but it wasn't enough. The Japanese fleet was still retreating, and there was still more to do. The smoke rose in thick black clouds, obscuring the view of the battle below. The American forces had launched wave after wave, but the Japanese were relentless, their fighters streaking through the air, forcing Jack and his comrades to fight for every inch of space. Jack's plane shuddered as another Zero came into view. This one was close, too close. He didn't have time to maneuver. He fired first, but the Zero was faster, cutting through the air with lethal precision. Jack's stomach lurched as the enemy pilot opened fire. His cockpit lit up with the flash of bullets, and Jack felt the sting of fear gnawing at him. This was it. This was where the battle would either be won or lost. He twisted the stick, diving and weaving as the Zero closed in, narrowly missing him. His engine sputtered as he pulled out of the dive, and for a moment Jack thought he was done. But then, from out of nowhere, another American fighter appeared, tearing through the air with deadly speed. The Zero broke off, its pilot clearly caught off guard. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The cavalry had arrived. But as he glanced back toward the enemy carriers, the sight before him was horrifying. The Japanese fleet had begun to scatter, retreating, but their damage was done. The American bombers, relentless and precise, were now wreaking havoc on the carriers. Jack's heart pounded as he realized they were winning. They were going to do it. The tide was turning, but there was still that lingering doubt, the gnawing sense that they were not yet out of danger. Mark was still missing, and Jack's mind refused to let go of that thread. The battle was reaching its climax, and while the Japanese fleet was crumbling, he knew that the psychological cost of this victory would leave scars that would never heal. For every man lost, for every bomber that had fallen from the sky, there would be no true victory, not without the heavy price of sacrifice. The crisis had come, and now only one thing remained: to survive and carry the story of what had happened to those who would never know. The smoke from burning carriers clung to the sky like an ominous veil, a reminder of the devastating battle that had unfolded. Jack Vincent's Wildcat skimmed just above the waves, the roar of the engine drowning out the chaos below. His heart pounded against his ribs, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But in the pit of his stomach, there was a growing emptiness. The Japanese fleet was in retreat. The moment of victory was upon them, And yet Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Mark was still out there. Somewhere. Jack's eyes darted around the sky, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy or his missing wingman. The battle had raged for hours, and the sky was filled with the remnants of shattered bombers, the twisted wreckage of planes once soaring above the Pacific. The Japanese carriers, though badly damaged, were not yet finished. Their crews fought fiercely, their determination to survive radiating from the burning decks below. "Jack, you still with me?" came the crackling voice of Commander Wade McCluskey over the radio. Jack gripped the controls tighter. "I'm here, McCluskey. Still got a job to finish." His mind raced, the tension mounting with every passing second. The Japanese fighters were fewer now, their numbers decimated by the relentless assault. But the American forces had paid a heavy price for every victory, and Jack's heart clenched as he realized that the full extent of their losses would only be known when the smoke cleared. As Jack pushed forward, determined to finish what they had started, he could feel the weight of the war bearing down on him. The battle for Midway had cost them so much. Too much. The Americans had lost men, planes, and ships, but the prize was within reach. The Japanese fleet was on the verge of collapse. But just as victory seemed assured, a new wave of terror emerged from the smoke. A solitary Japanese Zero streaked through the sky, its engine screaming as it locked onto Jack's tail. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The finality of it all. Jack's breath caught in his chest. He was too far from the fleet, too far from the cover of his comrades. He was alone. The Zero closed in fast, its guns blazing. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he jerked the control stick hard to the left, his plane tumbling through the air in a desperate attempt to evade the incoming fire. The enemy's bullets tore into the Wildcat, rattling the airframe and sending shudders of pain through the aircraft. Jack's hands tightened on the controls, fighting the instinct to panic. This wasn't the way it was supposed to end. And then, as if by sheer will, a shadow fell over him. Another plane, this time a U.S. Navy fighter, appeared out of the smoke, cutting through the sky with the speed and precision of a hawk. It was Mark's plane. Jack didn't hesitate for a second. His heart surged with relief as Mark's Wildcat slammed into the Zero's tail, gunfire exploding from both planes. The Japanese fighter veered off course, spiraling out of control as the pilot struggled to regain control. And then it was gone. "Jack!" Mark's voice crackled through the radio, his tone laced with tension and relief. "You good?" Jack's breath was heavy, but his voice was steady. "You're a damn lifesaver, Mark. Where the hell were you?" "I was right here the whole time, Jack. Just had to make sure this bastard didn't get away," Mark replied, his voice filled with determination. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jack allowed himself a moment to breathe. He glanced over at Mark's plane, catching a glimpse of his friend's grin through the canopy. But that smile, though comforting, was short-lived. There was still work to be done. Jack's eyes flickered back to the Japanese fleet. The carriers were still afloat, though their decks were a battlefield of flames and smoke. The Japanese had taken severe losses, but they were still dangerous. If they escaped now, if they could regroup and launch another offensive, the fight for Midway would be lost. "We can't let them get away," Jack muttered to himself, pushing the throttle forward. "Right behind you, Jack," Mark replied. They dove toward the enemy fleet once more, the roar of their engines the only sound in the vast expanse of the ocean. The destruction below was an ugly symphony, but it was a necessary one. They had come this far. They had fought too hard to let it slip away now. As they neared the Japanese carriers, a realization hit Jack with the force of a punch. The decision he had feared, the decision he had put off for so long, was now unavoidable. They had to finish the job. The Japanese carriers needed to be destroyed. But it was more than that. They needed to end this once and for all. The lives of every man on Midway, every soldier in the Pacific, depended on this final strike. "McCluskey, we're going in," Jack said, his voice calm despite the rising tide of anxiety in his chest. "Prepare for the final assault." The American bombers and fighters began their final dive, their bomb bays open and ready to release their deadly payloads. The Japanese carriers, already battered from earlier strikes, were vulnerable. But Jack knew this wouldn't be easy. The flak was thicker now, the air around him crackling with danger. Every maneuver felt like a gamble, and Jack knew that this was the moment that would define the war. But as he neared the carrier deck, something shifted. The explosion of a bomb from one of the American dive bombers rocked the sea beneath him, sending a shock wave that rattled Jack's plane. His heart skipped a beat. The carrier was sinking. It was happening. Victory was within reach. But then, as if by cruel design, another explosion shattered the air. A secondary blast from the explosion of a carrier's ammunition sent debris flying into the sky. A jagged piece of shrapnel pierced Jack's wing, tearing into the metal like paper. The plane buckled, the instruments flickering before shutting down entirely. "Jack!" Mark's voice came through the radio, frantic. "You okay?" Jack's hands trembled as he struggled to regain control. The plane was barely flying now, but he fought to keep it steady. The sky seemed to tilt around him, and the sea below was a blur of smoke and flame. He was losing control, but there was one thing left to do. Get the message out, deliver the final blow. With a final, desperate push, Jack aimed his plane toward the last remaining Japanese carrier. It was burning, its deck a twisted wreck of metal and fire. But Jack couldn't stop. The plane wavered as he pulled the trigger, sending his final payload into the heart of the carrier's remaining structure. The explosion was deafening, a roar that shook the air and the ground beneath him. And then everything went black. The battle had ended. The American forces had struck the final blow, and the Japanese fleet, crippled beyond repair, was forced to retreat. But for Jack, the cost had been high. His plane was down, his body battered and bruised, but he had done what was necessary. Midway had been won. The war would continue, but this battle would be remembered as a turning point, a moment where the tide shifted and the impossible became possible. And for Jack, as he lay in the wreckage of his plane, the weight of the sacrifice hit him hard. Victory had come, but it had come at a price, and the consequences of that price would echo through the years to come. The smoke from the burning carrier still hung thick in the air, a haunting reminder of the battle's ferocity. For Lieutenant Commander Jack Vincent, the world had gone quiet. The deafening roar of engines, the frantic radio calls, and the chaos of the skies had all faded into the background. Now all that remained was the distant rumble of explosions and the eerie stillness that followed. The battle for Midway had ended, but Jack's war was far from over. Jack awoke to the sharp sting of pain. His body ached, his muscles stiff and sore from the violent impact of his crash landing. The cockpit of his Wildcat had been torn apart, the canopy shattered by the force of the explosion. He was alive, as barely, but everything around him seemed distant and surreal. The pain in his chest, the dull throb in his head, all reminded him of the price he had paid. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light as he took in the wreckage around him. The plane had skidded across the ocean's surface, the metal crumpling under the force of the landing, but somehow Jack had survived. He pulled himself out of the wreckage, the cold ocean water lapping at his boots. He felt disoriented, his thoughts muddled by the trauma of the crash and the aftermath of the battle. His hands shook as he steadied himself against the wreck, but there was something deeper, something that gnawed at his soul. The victory at Midway had been hard won, but Jack could already feel the weight of the cost. It was a triumph, yes. The Japanese Navy had been crippled, their carriers sunk, their air superiority shattered. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned, and the United States now had a fighting chance to regain the lost ground. But for Jack, the victory felt hollow. His body ached, his heart heavy with the sacrifices made. Mark Holland had been by his side through it all, but he too was gone. Lost in the chaos of the dogfights, his plane shot down in the final hours of the battle. Jack stared out at the horizon, the ocean stretching endlessly before him. The beauty of the scene was starkly at odds with the devastation of the day. He had led men into battle, watched them fight and die, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. Was it worth it? Could the cost of so many lives ever be justified by the end result? The questions lingered, unanswered, in the back of his mind. He had always known war would demand sacrifice. That had been drilled into him from the moment he enlisted, from the first day he strapped on his flight suit and soared into the skies. But there was no way to prepare for the weight of those sacrifices. No training could teach him how to carry the ghosts of his fallen comrades, how to live with the knowledge that their deaths had bought him another day to fight. Jack had become a soldier because he believed in something greater than himself, in the cause of freedom, in the defense of his country. But now, standing in the wreckage of his plane, that cause seemed distant, fleeting. "Jack!" A voice called out to him, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. It was McCluskey, his commanding officer, waving from a nearby rescue boat. "We got you, Vincent. Let's get you back to the ship." Jack didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the horizon for a moment longer. Then he turned and slowly made his way toward the rescue boat. The world seemed to shift beneath his feet, the pain in his chest and legs intensifying with each step. The physical injury was nothing compared to the weight on his heart, but he kept moving. There was no time for doubt. There was no time for reflection. The rescue boat carried Jack and the other survivors back to the USS Yorktown. The ship, battered and scarred by the battle, was still standing, a testament to the resilience of the men who had fought aboard her. But as Jack climbed aboard, he noticed the solemn expressions on the faces of his fellow sailors. There was no celebration, no victory cheers. The cost had been too great. The men who had died, the pilots who had given their lives for this victory, weighed heavily on every man who remained. As Jack was helped onto the deck, McCluskey walked up beside him, his face grim but resolute. "We did it, Vincent. We stopped them. We've got a fighting chance now." Jack nodded, but there was no joy in his response. He had seen too much, lost too much, to feel the elation of victory. All he could feel was the crushing burden of what had been lost, of the men who had been left behind in the flames of battle. "You don't have to carry this alone," McCluskey said quietly, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "We all lost something today. But we won, Jack. We won." Jack looked up at him, searching McCluskey's eyes for some sign of the certainty he so desperately needed. But all he saw was the same hollow understanding, the same weight of loss that mirrored his own. There was no simple answer, no easy way to reconcile the horrors of war with the necessity of it. All they had was each other now, and the knowledge that they had done what was necessary to turn the tide of the war. In the days that followed, Jack remained on board the Yorktown, recovering from his injuries and reflecting on the battle that had defined his life. The victory at Midway would go down in history as a turning point in the Pacific War, a moment when the Japanese Empire's advance was halted and the United States began its long march to victory. But for Jack, the true cost of the battle was still being counted. The faces of the fallen, Mark, his friends, his fellow pilots, haunted him at night. The ghosts of those lost in the flames of battle were never far from his thoughts. As he sat on the deck of the ship, watching the calm waters of the Pacific stretch out before him, Jack realized that the war was far from over. Midway had been a victory, but it was only one battle in a long, bloody conflict. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, and there would be more sacrifices to come. But for the first time since the battle began, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace. He had survived, and in surviving, he had given the world a chance to live. In the years that followed, the Battle of Midway would become a symbol of American resilience and determination. It was a victory that turned the tide of the Pacific War. But for the men who fought there, the victory was bittersweet. They had lost so much to win, and the scars of that loss would remain with them forever. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 to 7, 1942, was one of the most decisive naval battles of World War II. It marked the turning point in the Pacific War, with the United States Navy defeating a Japanese attack on Midway Atoll, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and significantly weakening Japan's naval power. The victory was largely made possible by American codebreakers who had deciphered Japanese communication, allowing the U.S. Navy to anticipate and counter the Japanese attack. Midway remains a symbol of American bravery and strategic brilliance,